Sarah Mitchell had always been different from other women in Fort Davis, Texas. While most ladies spent their days tending to household duties and social gatherings, she found herself drawn to the rugged wilderness that stretched endlessly beyond the settlement's borders. Her father, a retired cavalry officer, had taught her to ride, shoot, and track with the skill of any seasoned frontiersman. These abilities would prove invaluable on that fateful morning in September 1878. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain as Sarah rode her mare, Duchess, along the familiar trail that wound through Devil's Canyon. She had ventured out early to check on the small herd of cattle her family grazed in the remote pasture, a routine task that usually brought her peace and solitude. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the only sounds were the gentle clopping of hooves against stone and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. As she rounded a bend in the canyon wall, an unusual sound made her pull up sharply on the reins. It was a low, guttural growling mixed with what sounded like human grunts of pain and frustration. Duchess pranced nervously, her ears swiveling forward as she sensed danger ahead. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to the Winchester rifle secured in her saddle holster, her father's training taking over despite the rapid beating of her heart. Dismounting quietly, she led Duchess to a cluster of mesquite bushes and secured the reins with practiced efficiency. The sounds were coming from just beyond a large boulder formation that jutted out from the canyon wall like ancient fingers reaching toward the sky. Sarah crept forward, using the natural cover of rocks and scrub brush to mask her approach. What she discovered would change the course of her life forever. Trapped between two massive rocks was an enormous black bear, its powerful jaws clamped around something metallic that glinted in the morning sunlight. The bear's movements were frantic and desperate as it tried to free itself from what Sarah quickly recognized as a steel leg trap, its serrated jaws buried deep in the animal's hind paw. But what made her gasp and press herself against the cold stone was the sight of a man. Clearly a Comanche warrior based on his distinctive clothing and long black hair, lying motionless just a few feet from the enraged bear. The warrior appeared to be unconscious, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead, where he had apparently struck the rocks during some kind of struggle. His breathing was shallow but steady, and Sarah could see that his left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, suggesting a serious injury. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place as she studied the scene more carefully. The trap had originally been set for the bear, probably by one of the local ranchers who had been losing livestock to predators. The Comanche must have discovered the trapped animal and attempted to free it, perhaps out of respect for the creature's plight, or maybe because his people considered the bear sacred. During his rescue attempt, something had gone wrong, and now both man and beast were in mortal danger. The bear's struggles were becoming more violent with each passing moment, its massive claws leaving deep gouges in the surrounding rock as it fought against the unyielding steel. Sarah knew that if the animal managed to free itself, it would likely turn its rage and pain on the unconscious warrior who lay helplessly nearby. The Comanche's position made it impossible for him to defend himself, and even if he regained consciousness, his injured leg would prevent any chance of escape. Sarah found herself facing an impossible decision. The sensible thing would be to mount Duchess and ride back to Fort Davis for help, but she knew that by the time she returned with assistance, both the bear and the warrior would likely be dead. The alternative was to act alone, risking her own life to save two creatures that most people in her community would consider enemies or dangerous nuisances. Her mind raced through the possible courses of action. She could try to shoot the bear, but the angle was poor, and a wounded bear would be even more dangerous than a trapped one. She might be able to reach the release mechanism on the trap, but that would require getting dangerously close to the animal's claws and teeth. There was also the warrior to consider. Moving him to safety would be difficult under the best circumstances and nearly impossible with an enraged bear nearby. As she wrestled with these thoughts, Sarah noticed something that made her decision for her. The warrior's eyes had opened, and though he remained perfectly still, she could see that he was now fully conscious and aware of his desperate situation. Their eyes met across the short distance, and in that moment, something passed between them that transcended the barriers of culture, language, and the generations of conflict that separated their peoples. The look in his dark eyes was not one of fear or resignation, but of quiet dignity and acceptance of whatever fate awaited him. Sarah saw in that gaze a reflection of her own stubborn determination and refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. She realized that this man, despite being her supposed enemy, possessed the same courage and strength of spirit that she had always admired in her father and the other soldiers she had grown up around. Without fully understanding why, Sarah knew that she could not abandon this warrior to die alone in the canyon. Something deep in her heart told her that saving him was not just the right thing to do, but perhaps the most important thing she would ever do in her life. The thought of riding away and leaving him to face his death while she remained safe was more unbearable than the risk of staying to help. Making her choice, Sarah checked her rifle once more and began planning her approach to the trapped bear. She had only one chance to get this right, and failure would likely mean death for all three of them. But as she looked once more into the warrior's eyes, she saw something there that gave her courage, a spark of hope that perhaps, against all odds, this day would not end in tragedy after all. The next few minutes would test every skill Sarah had learned during her unconventional upbringing. She studied the scene with the calculating eye of a strategist, noting every detail that might help or hinder her rescue attempt. The bear trap was an old but effective design, with a spring mechanism that required significant force to release. The chain attached to the trap was secured to a heavy iron stake driven deep into the rocky ground, preventing the bear from dragging the device away despite its massive strength. Sarah realized that her best chance lay not in confronting the bear directly, but in creating a distraction that would allow her to reach the trap's release mechanism. She remembered watching her father and his men use similar tactics during their campaigns against hostile wildlife that threatened the fort's livestock. The key was to use the animal's own instincts against it, while minimizing the risk to everyone involved. Moving carefully back to where Duchess waited, Sarah retrieved several items from her saddlebags that she hoped would prove useful. Among them was a small mirror her mother had insisted she carry for personal grooming, a practice Sarah had always considered frivolous until now. She also gathered some dried jerky, a coil of rope, and most importantly, a small powder charge that her father had taught her to use for clearing rock slides from trails. The plan that formed in her mind was dangerous and relied heavily on precise timing, but it offered the best hope for success she could devise under the circumstances. She would use the mirror to reflect sunlight directly into the bear's eyes, temporarily blinding and confusing the animal. During those crucial seconds of disorientation, she would approach the trap and attempt to trigger the release mechanism while simultaneously using the rope to pull the unconscious warrior to safety. Sarah positioned herself on a rocky outcrop that provided both cover and a clear line of sight to the trapped bear. The morning sun was now at the perfect angle to create a brilliant reflection from the mirror's surface. She practiced the movement several times, ensuring she could direct the reflected beam exactly where she needed it while maintaining her balance on the precarious perch. The Comanche warrior had been watching her preparations with growing understanding of her intentions. Despite his pain and the desperate nature of their situation, Sarah could see approval in his expression. He began to shift his position slightly, preparing to help however he could when the moment came. His movements were careful and deliberate, avoiding any sudden motions that might attract the bear's attention. When Sarah felt ready, she took a deep breath and angled the mirror toward the bear's face. The reflected sunlight struck the animal's eyes like a blazing torch, causing it to rear back with a roar of surprise and confusion. For a moment, the bear's struggles against the trap ceased as it tried to understand this new threat that seemed to come from the sky itself. Sarah seized her opportunity and leaped down from the rocks, landing hard on the canyon floor but maintaining her footing. The bear was shaking its massive head, trying to clear its vision, but Sarah knew she had only seconds before it would recover and become even more dangerous than before. She sprinted toward the trap, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the sound would alert every creature in the canyon. The release mechanism was more corroded than she had expected, and Sarah had to use both hands and all her strength to work the lever that would spring the trap open. The bear, sensing movement nearby, began to turn toward her, its small eyes gradually refocusing as the blindness caused by the reflected sunlight began to fade. Saliva dripped from its massive jaws as it prepared to defend itself against this new threat. Just as Sarah felt the trap mechanism beginning to give way under her efforts, the bear's paw came free with a wet, tearing sound that made her stomach lurch. The animal stumbled backward, blood streaming from the deep wounds where the trap's teeth had been embedded, but its freedom only seemed to increase its rage rather than calm it. The bear's attention was now fully focused on Sarah, who found herself trapped between the rocky walls with nowhere to run. The warrior, despite his injured leg, had managed to pull himself into a sitting position against the canyon wall. Sarah could see him reaching for something at his belt, and she realized he was drawing a knife, preparing to defend her even though his own condition made him vulnerable. The courage of this gesture struck her deeply, but she knew that in his current state, he would be no match for the enraged bear. Sarah's rifle was still slung across her shoulder, but she knew she would never have time to unsling it, aim and fire before the bear reached her. The animal was already beginning to charge, its massive bulk moving with surprising speed across the rocky ground. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, expecting to feel the crushing blow of claws and teeth, but instead heard the sharp crack of a gunshot echoing through the canyon. Opening her eyes, Sarah saw that the bear had stumbled and fallen just a few feet away from her. Blood spread slowly across the rocky ground, and the animal's breathing became labored and shallow before finally stopping altogether. Confused and shaking, Sarah looked around for the source of the shot and saw the Comanche warrior lowering a small pistol that he had somehow managed to draw and fire despite his injuries. The weapon appeared to be an old cavalry model, probably taken from a soldier during one of the many skirmishes that had occurred in the region over the years. The warrior's aim had been perfect, striking the bear in the heart and ending its suffering while simultaneously saving Sarah's life. The irony was not lost on either of them, that he had used a weapon of the white man's army to protect one of their own people. As the echoes of the gunshot faded away, and strange silence settled over the canyon, Sarah found herself staring at the warrior who had just saved her life, while he looked back at her with an expression that seemed to contain both gratitude for her attempted rescue and amazement at the unexpected turn of events. Neither of them spoke, but both understood that something profound had just occurred that would bind their fates together in ways they could not yet imagine. The immediate danger was over, but Sarah realized that their challenges were far from ended. The warrior's injuries were serious and required immediate attention, and she was still alone in hostile territory with a man that her own people would consider an enemy. The sound of the gunshot would likely attract attention from other inhabitants of the region, both human and animal, and she needed to make decisions quickly about what to do next. The silence that followed the gunshot seemed to stretch on forever, broken only by the sound of Sarah's rapid breathing and the distant call of a mourning dove from somewhere high on the canyon walls. She found herself studying the face of the man who had just saved her life, trying to reconcile everything she had been taught about the Comanche people with the reality of what had just occurred between them. His features were strong and weathered by years of life under the harsh Texas sun, with high cheekbones and deep-set eyes that seemed to hold both wisdom and sadness. A thin scar ran along his left jawline, probably from some long-ago battle, and his black hair was streaked with premature silver that suggested he had seen more than his share of hardship and loss. Despite his obvious pain from the leg injury, he maintained a dignity that Sarah found both impressive and humbling. Sarah realized that she was staring and quickly looked away, focusing instead on the practical matters that needed immediate attention. The warrior's leg was clearly broken and the gash on his forehead was still bleeding slowly. She had some basic medical supplies in her saddlebags, knowledge gained from helping the fort's doctor treat injured soldiers and settlers, but treating someone under these circumstances would present unique challenges. Moving carefully to avoid startling him, Sarah approached and gestured toward his injuries while speaking in the few words of Comanche she had picked up over the years from traders and scouts who had visited the fort. Her pronunciation was terrible, but the warrior seemed to understand her intentions and nodded his consent to her examination of his wounds. His trust in her, given the circumstances and their people's history, struck Sarah as both remarkable and deeply moving. The leg was definitely broken, but fortunately it appeared to be a clean fracture rather than a compound break. Sarah had watched the fort's doctor set similar injuries, and she believed she could create a temporary splint that would allow the warrior to be moved without causing additional damage. The head wound was less serious than it looked, though it would need to be cleaned and bandaged to prevent infection. As she worked, Sarah found herself talking to him in English, describing what she was doing and why. Even though she knew he probably understood very little of what she was saying, somehow the sound of her own voice seemed to calm both of them, making the surreal situation feel more manageable. To her surprise, the warrior began responding in heavily accented but clearly understandable English, revealing that he knew far more of her language than she had initially assumed. His name, he told her, was Standing Wolf, and he was a medicine man among his people as well as a respected warrior. He had been traveling alone to gather certain plants that grew only in this particular canyon, herbs that were essential for treating sick children in his band's camp. The trapped bear had been suffering for what appeared to be several days, and Standing Wolf's conscience would not allow him to leave any creature in such agony, regardless of the personal risk involved. Sarah learned that Standing Wolf's understanding of English came from years of serving as an interpreter during various peace negotiations between the Comanche and the army. He had always believed that communication between their peoples offered the only hope for ending the cycles of violence that had claimed so many lives on both sides. This philosophy had made him controversial among some of his own people, who viewed any cooperation with whites as betrayal. As Sarah carefully cleaned and bandaged his wounds, Standing Wolf told her about his family. He had a wife named Morning Star and 2 young children, a son and daughter who were waiting for his return at their winter camp several days' ride to the north. The herbs he had been gathering were desperately needed to treat a fever that had been affecting the children in their band, and his failure to return with the medicine would likely result in more deaths among the most vulnerable members of his community. This revelation created a new dilemma for Sarah. She had initially planned to help Standing Wolf reach safety and then return to Fort Davis to report the incident to her father and the other authorities. But now she understood that his mission was one of mercy, intended to save the lives of innocent children who would die without the medicines he had come to collect. The thought of those children suffering while Standing Wolf recovered from his injuries was almost unbearable. Sarah found herself proposing something that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. She offered to help Standing Wolf complete his mission, gathering the herbs he needed while his leg healed enough for travel. She could learn to identify the plants he required and collect them under his guidance, allowing him to fulfill his responsibilities to his people, despite his physical limitations. The suggestion clearly surprised Standing Wolf, who studied her face intently as if trying to determine whether she was sincere or merely making some elaborate joke at his expense. The idea that a white woman would voluntarily risk her safety and reputation to help save Comanche children was so far outside his experience that he seemed to struggle with accepting its reality. Sarah pressed her argument, explaining that she had grown up learning to identify medicinal plants from her father's army surgeons and that she understood the urgency of treating sick children regardless of their race or tribal affiliation. She also pointed out that Standing Wolf's injuries would prevent him from traveling safely for several days at minimum, and that during that time the children in his camp would continue to suffer without the medicines they needed. Gradually, Standing Wolf began to accept that Sarah's offer was genuine, and his expression shifted from suspicion to something approaching wonder. He had spent years trying to build bridges between their peoples, often facing distrust and hostility from both sides, and now he was being offered help from the most unexpected source imaginable. A white woman was volunteering to risk everything to save Comanche children she had never met and would probably never see. The practical arrangements they worked out were complex but manageable. Sarah would ride back to Fort Davis and report that she had encountered bear sign in the canyon and would be camping out for several days to track the animal, a story that would explain her extended absence without raising suspicions about her true activities. She would return with additional medical supplies and food, and Standing Wolf would teach her to identify and properly prepare the medicinal plants his people needed. As the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the canyon, casting long shadows across the rocky walls, Sarah helped Standing Wolf move to a more sheltered location where he could rest comfortably while she made her preparations. The dead bear had already begun to attract flies and scavengers, so they positioned themselves upwind and out of sight of the carcass, while remaining close enough to the water source that trickled down from the rocks above. Before she left to retrieve additional supplies, Sarah took one last look at Standing Wolf, still hardly believing the events of the day and the commitment she had made to this stranger, who had become something much more significant than an enemy. The trust that had developed between them seemed fragile and precious, something that needed to be protected and nurtured, despite all the forces that would work against it. The next 3 days passed like something from a dream that Sarah would never have imagined possible. Each morning she would leave Fort Davis before dawn, telling her father that she was tracking the bear that had been threatening their cattle, and each evening she would return with carefully crafted stories about signs she had found and the elusive nature of her quarry. Her father, trusting in her wilderness skills and accustomed to her independent nature, never questioned these explanations. During the daylight hours, Sarah found herself living in a world completely removed from everything she had known before. Standing Wolf proved to be an extraordinary teacher, possessing knowledge about the natural world that went far beyond anything she had learned from books or army doctors. Under his patient guidance, she began to understand the canyon ecosystem in ways that transformed her perception of the seemingly barren landscape. The herbs they gathered were not random weeds but carefully selected, plants that grew in specific microclimates within the canyon walls. Standing Wolf taught her to recognize the subtle differences between beneficial and harmful varieties, explaining how factors like soil composition, water availability, and sun exposure affected the medicinal properties of each species. His knowledge had been passed down through generations of healers, refined through centuries of careful observation and experimentation. Sarah discovered that Standing Wolf's broken leg was healing remarkably well under her care. Her combination of modern medical techniques and his traditional knowledge of healing plants created a treatment approach that proved more effective than either method alone. The head wound had closed cleanly, leaving only a thin red line that would eventually fade to match the other scars that marked his weathered face. As they worked together, conversation between them flowed more easily than either had expected. Standing Wolf's English, while accented, was precise and eloquent, reflecting his role as a negotiator and his natural intelligence. Sarah found herself sharing stories about her unconventional upbringing, her love of the wilderness, and her frustration with the limited opportunities available to women in frontier society. Standing Wolf spoke about his own struggles within Comanche culture, where his advocacy for peaceful coexistence with whites had earned him both respect and suspicion from different factions within his band. He described the terrible choices facing his people as their traditional way of life was systematically destroyed by encroaching settlement and government policies designed to force them onto reservations where many would slowly die from disease and despair. These conversations revealed to Sarah the human cost of the conflict she had always viewed from a military perspective. Through Standing Wolf's eyes, she began to understand that the Comanche raids and resistance that her father's soldiers fought against were not acts of mindless savagery but desperate attempts by a proud people to preserve their families and culture in the face of overwhelming external pressure. On the afternoon of the third day, as they prepared the final batch of medicines needed for Standing Wolf's return journey, Sarah noticed a change in his demeanor. He had grown quieter and more thoughtful, occasionally stopping his work to study her face with an expression she could not quite interpret. When she finally asked what was troubling him, his answer surprised her with its directness and honesty. Standing Wolf told her that he had been thinking about their parting, which would come the following morning, when his leg was strong enough to support the journey back to his people. The thought of returning to his previous life, knowing that she existed but was forever beyond his reach, had become almost unbearable. Over the past few days, he had come to care for her in ways that transcended gratitude for her help or admiration for her courage. Sarah felt her heart skip as she listened to his words, realizing that her own feelings had been developing along similar lines without her fully acknowledging them. The connection between them had grown beyond the shared danger that had brought them together, becoming something deeper and more complex that neither of them had expected or prepared for. The practical obstacles to any relationship between them seemed insurmountable. They came from peoples who had been at war for decades, lived in completely different worlds, and followed customs that would make acceptance of their union nearly impossible on either side. Sarah would be branded a traitor by her own community, while Standing Wolf would face accusations of betraying his people's trust and compromising his position as a medicine man and negotiator. Yet as they talked through the evening, sharing their fears and hopes while the canyon walls echoed with the calls of nightbirds and the distant howl of coyotes, both began to believe that their feelings for each other might be strong enough to overcome even these seemingly impossible barriers. They spoke of the possibility that love and understanding between individuals could eventually lead to broader peace between their peoples, that their relationship might serve as a bridge across the divide of hatred and mistrust. Standing Wolf described his vision of a future where white settlers and native peoples could coexist peacefully, sharing the land and learning from each other, rather than fighting over it. Sarah found herself imagining a life where she could use her unique position to facilitate communication and cooperation between the two communities, perhaps preventing some of the bloodshed that seemed inevitable given the current trajectory of events. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, they moved closer to their small campfire for warmth. Sarah found herself studying Standing Wolf's profile in the flickering light, memorizing every detail of his face and trying to imagine what it would be like to never see him again. The thought of returning to her previous existence, going through the motions of conventional frontier life, while knowing that her heart remained with this remarkable man, seemed impossible to contemplate. Standing Wolf reached out and gently touched her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary. In that moment, Sarah understood that whatever challenges lay ahead, she could not simply walk away from what had developed between them. The connection they had forged was too precious and rare to abandon without a fight. They began making plans for future meetings, discussing ways they could continue to see each other despite the risks and obstacles involved. Standing Wolf knew of several remote locations where they could meet safely, places known only to the Comanche and far from any white settlements or military patrols. Sarah's wilderness skills and freedom of movement would make it possible for her to reach these rendezvous points without arousing suspicion. As dawn approached and the time came for Standing Wolf's departure, both understood that they were embarking on a journey that would test their courage, their commitment, and their belief in the possibility that love could overcome even the deepest divisions between peoples. The herbs that would save Comanche children were safely packed in Standing Wolf's saddlebags, but the real treasure they had discovered in Devil's Canyon was something far more precious and potentially transformative. The weeks following Standing Wolf's departure were among the most difficult of Sarah's life. She went through the motions of her daily routine at Fort Davis, helping her father with his correspondence, tending to household duties, and maintaining the facade of normalcy that her secret required. But beneath the surface, every moment was filled with thoughts of the Comanche medicine man who had captured her heart in the most unlikely of circumstances. 2 weeks after their parting, Sarah received the signal they had arranged. A small pile of stones arranged in a specific pattern near the old water well outside town told her that Standing Wolf was waiting at their predetermined meeting place, a hidden grove of cottonwood trees beside a spring-fed pool about 10 miles north of the fort. Sarah's pulse quickened as she recognized the sign, and she immediately began planning how to slip away without arousing suspicion. The reunion was everything Sarah had hoped for and more. Standing Wolf's leg had healed completely, leaving him with only a slight limp that would probably disappear with time. More importantly, his mission had been successful. The medicines they had gathered together had arrived in time to save the lives of 3 children who had been near death from fever, and the grateful families had hailed Standing Wolf as a hero for his dedication and sacrifice. But Standing Wolf made it clear that Sarah deserved equal credit for the children's recovery. Without her courage in freeing him from the bear trap, and her willingness to help gather the necessary herbs, the healing plants would never have reached his people in time. The children's parents had been amazed to learn that a white woman had risked everything to save their little ones, and several had expressed a desire to meet this remarkable person who had shown such unexpected compassion. As summer turned to autumn, Sarah and Standing Wolf established a pattern of secret meetings that allowed their relationship to deepen and flourish despite the extraordinary obstacles they faced. They would meet every 2 or 3 weeks at various remote locations known only to Standing Wolf, places where ancient springs bubbled up from underground sources or where hidden canyons provided shelter from the harsh West Texas weather. During these stolen hours together, Sarah learned about Comanche culture in ways that no white person had ever been privileged to experience. Standing Wolf taught her the traditional stories of his people, sharing legends about brave warriors, wise chiefs, and the spiritual beliefs that guided Comanche life. She learned to prepare traditional foods, to identify the subtle signs that revealed animal tracks and weather patterns, and to understand the complex social relationships that governed tribal society. In return, Sarah shared her own world with Standing Wolf, describing the books she had read, the music she loved, and the dreams she harbored for a different kind of future. She taught him to write in English, watching with delight as his strong hands learned to form letters and words that would allow him to communicate more effectively during future negotiations with white authorities. Their conversations revealed the tragic misunderstandings that fueled the ongoing conflict between their peoples. Sarah learned that many of the Comanche raids that terrorized frontier settlements were actually desperate attempts to recover stolen horses or to rescue family members who had been captured by white raiders. Standing Wolf discovered that many of the harsh military actions taken against his people were motivated by fear and misinformation, rather than deliberate cruelty. Both began to envision ways they might use their unique relationship to facilitate better communication and understanding between the two communities. Standing Wolf suggested that Sarah could serve as an unofficial intermediary, helping to clarify misunderstandings before they escalated into violence. Sarah proposed that Standing Wolf could work with sympathetic whites to establish trading relationships that would benefit both sides, while reducing the tensions that led to conflict. As winter approached, their meetings became more challenging to arrange. The harsh weather made travel difficult, and Sarah's extended absences from the fort were becoming harder to explain. Her father had begun to notice her frequent disappearances and her distracted behavior, though he attributed these changes to natural restlessness rather than anything more serious. The crisis came in late November, when a Comanche raid on a nearby ranch resulted in the deaths of 3 settlers and the theft of valuable livestock. The attack had been carried out by a rival band that opposed Standing Wolf's peaceful policies, but the distinction was lost on the outraged white community. Sarah's father received orders to organize a punitive expedition against any Comanche found in the region, and Sarah realized that Standing Wolf might be in mortal danger if he attempted to keep their next scheduled meeting. Against Standing Wolf's explicit instructions, Sarah rode out to warn him of the danger, using skills she had learned from him to track his band to their winter camp in a remote valley north of the Pecos River. The journey took her 3 days through country that was both beautiful and treacherous, testing every survival skill she possessed while pushing her physical endurance to its absolute limits. Her arrival at the Comanche camp created a sensation that could have easily turned deadly. Sarah was the first white person ever to enter this particular stronghold voluntarily, and many of the warriors' initial impulse was to treat her as an enemy spy who should be captured or killed. Only Standing Wolf's immediate intervention and his reputation within the band prevented violence from erupting. The lengthy council meeting that followed was unlike anything in Comanche history. Sarah found herself seated in the center of a circle of fierce warriors and wise elders, all of whom were trying to understand why a white woman would risk her life to warn them of impending military action. Standing Wolf served as her advocate and interpreter, but the ultimate decision about her fate rested with the band's war chief and council of elders. Sarah's courage and honesty during this interrogation won the grudging respect of even her harshest questioners. She explained her relationship with Standing Wolf openly and without apology, making it clear that her loyalty was to him personally rather than to his people as a whole. She warned them about the approaching soldiers and suggested ways they might avoid confrontation while maintaining their dignity and freedom. The council's final decision surprised everyone, including Standing Wolf. Rather than viewing Sarah as a threat or anomaly, the elders recognized her as a potential bridge between worlds that had been kept apart by mistrust and misunderstanding. They formally welcomed her into their band with a ceremony that acknowledged her as Standing Wolf's chosen partner, while also recognizing her unique status as an intermediary between their peoples. That night, as Sarah slept wrapped in warm buffalo robes beside the fire in Standing Wolf's lodge, she realized that her life had taken a turn that would have been unimaginable just a few months earlier. She had found not only love but also a purpose that transcended the narrow boundaries of her previous existence. The risks were enormous, but the potential rewards for both their peoples made every danger seem worthwhile. The winter that followed Sarah's acceptance into Standing Wolf's band proved to be a turning point not only in their personal relationship, but in the broader conflict between their peoples. Living among the Comanche gave Sarah insights that no white person had ever possessed, while her presence in the camp forced the warriors to confront their own assumptions about their supposed enemies. Sarah's medical knowledge, combined with the traditional healing wisdom she learned from Standing Wolf, made her invaluable during the harsh winter months when illness and injury were constant threats. She helped treat everything from childhood fevers to battle wounds, earning the respect and gratitude of people who had initially viewed her with deep suspicion. Her willingness to work alongside Comanche women in their daily tasks demonstrated a humility that gradually won over even her most skeptical critics. Standing Wolf's status within the band was enhanced rather than diminished by his relationship with Sarah. The success of their partnership in treating the sick children had already established his reputation as someone whose judgment could be trusted, and Sarah's courage in warning the band about the approaching soldiers proved that his faith in her was justified. The other warriors began to seek his advice more frequently, recognizing that his unique perspective might offer solutions to problems that traditional approaches had failed to resolve. The military expedition that Sarah had risked everything to warn them about never materialized as expected. Her father, Colonel Mitchell, had grown increasingly concerned about his daughter's extended absences and had delayed the punitive mission while trying to locate her. When Sarah failed to return from what she had claimed was a hunting trip, the colonel faced the terrible possibility that his daughter had been captured or killed by the very people he had been ordered to attack. The resolution came in early spring, when Standing Wolf and Sarah jointly appeared at Fort Davis under a flag of truce, accompanied by several other Comanche leaders who had been convinced to participate in peace negotiations. The sight of his daughter, clearly unharmed and obviously in love with the Comanche medicine man, left Colonel Mitchell speechless with a mixture of relief, anger, and confusion that took him several minutes to sort through. The peace talks that followed were unlike any that had been attempted in the region before. Sarah served as both translator and cultural interpreter, helping each side understand not just the words but the deeper meanings behind their counterparts' statements and proposals. Her unique position allowed her to identify areas of common ground that might otherwise have been overlooked, while her personal relationships with leaders on both sides gave her credibility that no outside mediator could have possessed. Standing Wolf proved to be a masterful negotiator, combining his natural intelligence with years of experience in dealing with white authorities. He presented the Comanche perspective with clarity and dignity, explaining how their recent actions had been driven by desperation rather than mere aggression. He also demonstrated his people's willingness to coexist peacefully with white settlers, provided that certain basic rights and territories were respected. The preliminary agreement that emerged from these talks established the first successful peace treaty between the local Comanche bands and the military authorities in more than a decade. The accord included provisions for shared grazing rights in certain areas, protocols for resolving disputes without violence, and most importantly, recognition of Standing Wolf's band as a legitimate political entity with whom the government could negotiate directly. Colonel Mitchell's acceptance of his daughter's relationship with Standing Wolf was gradual but genuine. Initially motivated primarily by his relief at her safe return, the colonel began to appreciate Standing Wolf's character and abilities as he observed him during the negotiations. The Comanche leader's obvious love for Sarah, combined with his intelligence and integrity, eventually won over even the skeptical military officer. The wedding ceremony that took place later that spring was unprecedented in the history of the Texas frontier. Conducted according to both Comanche and Christian traditions, the celebration brought together members of both communities in a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect that few had believed possible. Sarah wore a dress that combined white satin with traditional Comanche beadwork, symbolizing the union of two worlds that had found common ground in love. The couple established their home in a valley that straddled the boundary between white and Comanche territories, creating a neutral ground where members of both communities could meet safely for trade and communication. Sarah's house became an unofficial embassy, where disputes could be resolved and misunderstandings clarified before they escalated into violence. Their first child, a son they named David Standing Wolf Mitchell, was born the following winter and was welcomed by both communities as a symbol of hope for the future. The boy grew up speaking both English and Comanche, learning the customs and values of both cultures while developing his own unique perspective on the world around him. Standing Wolf's influence within Comanche society continued to grow as other bands witnessed the success of his peaceful policies. The prosperity and security enjoyed by his people, combined with their good relationships with neighboring white settlements, attracted followers from across the region. Sarah's role as a bridge between worlds became increasingly important as more leaders sought her advice on dealing with the changing circumstances of frontier life. The broader impact of their union extended far beyond their immediate community. Word of the successful peace agreement and the remarkable love story that had made it possible spread throughout Texas and beyond, inspiring similar efforts at reconciliation in other regions. Sarah began corresponding with government officials in Washington, advocating for policies that would protect Native American rights while promoting peaceful coexistence. As the years passed, Sarah and Standing Wolf's love story became legendary throughout the Southwest. Their example demonstrated that even the deepest cultural divisions could be bridged by individuals willing to risk everything for understanding and compassion. The children they raised grew up to become leaders in their own right, carrying forward their parents' legacy of peace and cooperation. The bear trap that had first brought them together was eventually mounted on a post near their home, serving as a reminder of how a moment of courage and compassion could change the course of history. Visitors from both communities would often ask about the rusted steel device, and Sarah would tell them the story of how she had risked everything to free a stranger from its jaws, only to discover that in saving him, she had found her own true destiny. Their love had indeed conquered all, transforming not only their own lives, but the lives of countless others who benefited from the peace and understanding they had worked so hard to achieve. In a land where hatred and violence had once seemed inevitable, Sarah and Standing Wolf proved that love, courage, and mutual respect could create possibilities that no one had dared to imagine.